James Miller wiped sweat from his brow as he hiked deeper into the Montana wilderness. The July heat was unforgiving, even under the canopy of pines in the Bitterroot National Forest. As a wildlife rehabilitation specialist with 15 years of experience, he'd received countless calls about injured animals, but this one felt different. About half a mile ahead, called Sarah Winters, a local park ranger who had reported the situation. I was doing my regular patrol when I heard it crying. James nodded, adjusting his gear. His backpack contained a small animal carrier, medical, supplies, and a tranquilizer gun, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. According to Sarah, they were looking for an injured bobcat kitten, likely orphaned after recent wildfires had swept through portions of the forest. "There," Sarah pointed, toward a fallen log. "That's where I spotted it yesterday." James approached cautiously, his experienced eyes scanning the area. A faint mewling sound caught his attention, and he gestured for Sarah to stay back. Crouching low, he peered beneath the charred remains of a large pine. The bobcat kitten couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, a tiny ball of spotted fur with oversized paws and tufted ears. But what concerned James immediately was the severely burned hind leg and the dehydrated state of the animal. "Hey there, little one," he whispered, slowly reaching into his pack for a pair of thick gloves. Wild bobcats, even young ones, were unpredictable and dangerous when cornered. The kitten hissed weakly, attempting to back further under the log. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you," James continued in the same soft tone he'd used successfully with countless wild animals. With practiced movements, he prepared a small amount of sedative, just enough to calm the kitten without risking its fragile health. Sarah watched from a distance. Will it survive? James carefully administered the sedative using a long-handled syringe. Hard to say. Burns, dehydration, probably malnourished, but if we can get it to the center within the hour, it has a fighting chance. Within minutes, the kitten's resistance faded, and James was able to gently place it in the carrier. He took a moment to examine the burns more closely. These are second-degree burns. Poor thing must have been caught in the wildfire's path. He gave the kitten a small amount of water using a dropper. "I'm naming him Ember. Seems fitting." The hike back to their vehicles was tense but quick. James kept a close eye on the carrier, occasionally speaking softly to the sedated bobcat. At the parking area, he transferred the carrier to his specialized veterinary truck. "I'll call you with updates," he promised Sarah, as he carefully placed the carrier in the climate-controlled compartment. The drive to Wild Montana Rehabilitation Center took 40 minutes, during which James called ahead to prepare his team for the incoming patient. By the time he arrived, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the center's veterinarian, was ready with a treatment area prepared. "Male bobcat kitten, approximately 8 weeks old," James reported as they transferred Ember to the examination table. "Second-degree burns on right hind leg, severe dehydration and possible smoke inhalation." Elena nodded, already examining the tiny predator. "Let's start with fluids and pain management, then address these burns." The next few hours were critical. Ember received intravenous fluids, antibiotics, and specialized treatment for his burns. Throughout the procedures, James noticed something unusual about the bobcat kitten. Despite being wild, it seemed unusually tolerant of human handling, even after the sedative wore off. "That's strange," Elena remarked after cleaning the wounded leg. "I've treated dozens of bobcat kittens, and they usually try to take my face off by now, sedated or not." James nodded thoughtfully. "Could be shock or just extreme weakness. Let's get him settled in isolation. He'll need round-the-clock monitoring for the next 48 hours. As James prepared a special isolated recovery habitat with heating pads and soft bedding, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ember was different from other wild bobcats he'd rehabilitated over the years. Most fought against human contact from the moment they regained consciousness. Ember, however, watched them with alert but calm blue eyes. "Get some rest, little guy," James said as he closed the door to the isolation room. "Tomorrow's another day." Little did he know how different that day would be. The following morning, James arrived early at the rehabilitation center, eager to check on Ember. He expected to find a more alert and potentially aggressive wild bobcat now that the initial shock and sedation had worn off. What he found instead left him speechless. Ember was awake, sitting upright in his enclosure, but instead of the typical defensive posture of a wild bobcat, ears flat, teeth bared, the kitten was watching the door with perked ears. When James entered, Ember made a sound that resembled a domestic cat's meow. "Well, good morning to you too," James said, surprised. He approached cautiously, clipboard in hand, to note Ember's condition. What happened next defied all his experience with wild predators. Ember stood on 3 legs, favoring his bandaged one, and moved toward James rather than retreating to the back of the enclosure. The bobcat kitten actually pressed against the front of the cage, as if seeking contact. "That's unusual," James muttered, making notes. Eleanor entered the room carrying medications and fresh bandages. "How's our patient this morning? See?" "For yourself," James gestured toward the enclosure. Elena observed Ember's behavior with professional interest. "Interesting. Let's check those vitals and change the bandage." Typically, handling a wild bobcat required protective equipment and often sedation. But when James carefully opened the enclosure door, Ember remained calm. The kitten actually leaned into James's touch as he checked the animal's temperature. "This is unprecedented," Elena said, her brow furrowed in concentration as she examined the burned leg. "His burns are already showing signs of healing, but this behavior, it's more like a domestic animal than a wild bobcat." Over the next few days, Ember's unusual behavior became the talk of the rehabilitation center. The bobcat kitten not only tolerated human handling, but seemed to actively seek it out. He would purr loudly during examinations, play with enrichment, toys like a domestic kitten, and even began responding to his name. "It's like he's imprinted on humans," suggested Marcus, one of the wildlife technicians. "But that would mean he had human contact from birth, which is highly unlikely for a wild bobcat in the Bitterroot." James spent extra time observing Ember, noting every behavior that seemed atypical for a wild bobcat. The kitten had begun following him around the examination room during checkups, batting playfully at his shoelaces like a pet cat might do. "The problem is," James explained during a staff meeting 1 week after Ember's rescue, "if he doesn't maintain his natural fear of humans, we can't release him back into the wild. He wouldn't survive." The center's protocol was clear. Rehabilitation meant preparing animals for eventual return to their natural habitat. Animals that became too habituated to humans often couldn't be released. "Let's give it more time," Eleanor suggested. "Sometimes wildness reasserts itself as they mature." But as the days turned into weeks, Ember's behavior only became more domesticated. He learned to walk on a harness for short exercise periods in a secure outdoor enclosure. He played fetch with small toys, returning them to whoever had thrown them. Most surprisingly, he started responding to basic commands like sit and come, behaviors more typical of a dog than any wild feline. "He follows me around like a Labrador puppy," James told Sarah when she visited to check on the bobcat's progress. "Watch this." James called Ember's name, and the now 12-week-old bobcat came trotting over, his once injured leg now fully healed. When James sat on a bench in the exercise area, Ember jumped up beside him and rubbed his head against James's arm, seeking affection. "That's incredible," Sarah whispered, maintaining her distance as James had instructed. "But what does this mean for his release?" James sighed, gently scratching behind Ember's tufted ears. "That's the million-dollar question. The committee meets next week to decide his fate." The Rehabilitation Center's release committee had the final say on whether an animal was suitable for return to the wild. For Ember, the prospects didn't look good. His injuries had healed remarkably well, but his behavior made him a poor candidate for survival in the wild. As James prepared his presentation for the committee, he found himself in an ethical dilemma. As a wildlife specialist, he believed wild animals belonged in nature, but he also recognized that Ember's unusual behavior might make that impossible. The night before the committee meeting, James stayed late at the center, sitting outside Ember's enclosure. The bobcat had grown considerably in the month since his rescue, his spotted kitten fur gradually giving way to the more uniform coat of an adolescent bobcat. "What are we going to do with you?" James asked softly. Ember responded by pressing his face against the mesh, purring loudly. The answer, James realized, might require thinking outside the box, something he'd never considered in his 15 years of wildlife rehabilitation work. The rehabilitation center's conference room was unusually crowded. Word had spread about the puppy-like Bobcat, drawing interest from staff members not typically involved in release decisions. James stood at the front of the room, his presentation materials organized neatly beside him. On the large screen behind him, photos and videos of Ember's progress played on a loop, from the severely injured kitten they'd rescued to the playful, adolescent Bobcat he'd become. "Thank you all for coming," James began, his voice professional despite his emotional investment in the case. "As you know, we're here to determine the appropriate course of action for Ember, the male Bobcat rescued from the Bitterroot wildfire area approximately 1 month ago." The committee members, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the center's director Dr. Michael Chen, and 2 representatives from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, nodded in acknowledgement. James proceeded with his presentation, detailing Ember's physical recovery, which had been remarkable. The once severely burned leg had healed with minimal scarring, and all vital signs were excellent. Then came the more complicated part. As documented extensively in my reports, Ember exhibits behavior that is highly atypical for a wild bobcat, James explained, playing a video of Ember responding to commands and playing fetch. Despite no evidence of previous human contact before his rescue, he has displayed behavioral patterns more consistent with domestic canines than wild felines. Dr. Chen leaned forward. "In your professional opinion, James, what are Ember's chances of survival if released back into the wild?" James took a deep breath. "Based on his current behavior, I believe Ember would either approach humans, putting himself at risk for hunting or defensive actions, or he would fail to effectively hunt and defend territory against other predators. His survival chances would be extremely low." A silence fell over the room as the committee considered this assessment. "What are our alternatives?" asked Lisa Blackfoot, one of the Fish and Wildlife representatives. "There are several educational wildlife facilities that might accept him," James replied, having researched this possibility extensively. He could serve as an ambassador animal, helping educate the public about bobcats and wildfire impacts on native wildlife. Elena spoke up. "I've contacted 3 such facilities that have the proper permits and expertise. 2 have expressed strong interest." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, weighing various options against what would be best for Ember and the rehabilitation center's mission. Throughout the conversation, James maintained his professional demeanor, though everyone in the room knew how attached he had become to the unusual bobcat. Finally, Dr. Chen addressed the committee. "Based on the evidence presented and our discussion, it seems clear that release is not in this animal's best interest. I propose we move forward with placement at an educational facility, with preference given to those within Montana to keep him in his native region." The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, James returned to Ember's enclosure, a mixture of emotions washing over him. While he had always believed wild animals belonged in the wild, he knew this was the right decision for Ember's safety and well-being. "Well, buddy, looks like you're going to have a different kind of life," he told the bobcat, who responded by immediately coming to the front of the enclosure and purring. "Not the mountains I'd hoped for you, but still a good one." In the following weeks, James worked closely with the Montana Wildlife Education Center, the facility chosen for Ember's permanent home. He helped design a spacious naturalistic enclosure that would provide the growing bobcat with ample enrichment while allowing him the human interaction he seemed to crave. On the day of the transfer, James personally transported Ember to his new home. The education center had prepared a welcome celebration, with staff eager to meet the bobcat they'd heard so much about. "He's even friendlier than you described," remarked the center's lead keeper, Angela, as Ember confidently explored his new enclosure, occasionally returning to the humans watching him for reassurance. "He'll do well here," James said, watching, as Ember discovered a climbing structure and bounded up it with typical feline grace. "And he'll help people understand the impact of wildfires on wildlife, maybe even inspire better conservation practices." As part of the arrangement, James would serve as a consulting specialist for Ember's care, visiting regularly to monitor his adjustment. It wasn't the outcome he'd initially envisioned when he'd rescued a badly burned bobcat kitten from beneath a fallen tree, but seeing Ember thriving, even if in captivity, brought its own satisfaction. 6 months later, Ember had become the star attraction at the education center. Visitors were captivated by the bobcat, who came when called and played like a domestic dog. Behind each presentation, however, was an important conservation message about wildfire impacts and the delicate balance of wildlife rehabilitation. During one of his regular visits, James watched from the back of the crowd as Angela gave a presentation with Ember demonstrating natural bobcat behaviors, along with a few not-so-natural ones that always delighted the audience. While Ember's story is unique, Angela was explaining to the rapt visitors, it highlights the complex challenges wildlife face in our changing environment. Not every animal rescued can return to the wild, but each one teaches us something valuable about conservation and our responsibility to protect natural habitats. As if on cue, Ember looked across the crowd and spotted James. The bobcat's ears perked up, and he let out a distinctive greeting call that James had come to recognize. A young girl in the audience noticed the interaction. "He knows you!" she exclaimed as James approached the enclosure after the presentation. James nodded, smiling as Ember pressed against the mesh to greet him. "We've known each other a long time. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, for animals and humans alike." As he drove back to the rehabilitation center later that day, James reflected on Ember's journey. The bobcat would never know the full freedom of the wilderness, but he had found his own place in the world, one where he was safe, content, and making a difference by connecting people to the wild places and creatures that needed their protection. In wildlife rehabilitation, success was typically measured by an animal's return to the wild. But in Ember's case, success had taken a different form, a reminder that nature, like life, sometimes followed paths no one could predict.